Welcome to our series on global challenges, pandemic, and the world order. This is our last and final in the series, and we'll focus this week's conversation on refugees and migration. We are thrilled to have three great interviews as part of this segment. The first one, I interview Kelly Clements, who is the UN's Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees. Kelly comes to us both as a Georgetown practitioner in residence, so a part of our community, but comes with an extraordinarily distinguished career in migration and refugee issues from a US government perspective and an international organization perspective. We also have Catherine Donato, who is the director of the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown University, interviewing Deputy Director General for the International Organization for Migration, Laura Thompson, to look specifically at the issues of what the IOM is doing and what migration looks like in an era of COVID. And finally, we have an interview that was conducted by Professor Beth Ferris with Robert Mominee. Robert is a recent MSFS graduate and is currently serving with the International Organization for Migration in South Sudan. The views that Robert shares are his own personal views and not one of the institution. We hope you enjoy these interviews. Welcome to our conversation on refugees and migration. We have with us today one of the leading experts on refugees and a person who has tirelessly over many, many decades served the refugee community in so many different capacities, and in her current capacity as the United Nations Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees, she has the bird's eye view of what is going on with refugees around the world and is leading the effort to ensure that the international community is responding to the needs of the most vulnerable around the world. Kelly Clements, thank you for being here. It's just a wonderful opportunity for us to be in conversation with Kelly. She's been part of the Georgetown community for some time as a practitioner in residence and as a frequent visitor to campus and in Zoom meetings with our students as well. So Kelly, thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you, Nicole.
Excellent. So let's start with what the world looked like before COVID, if we can remember back that far. What would you say were the challenges that were facing the refugee community and the refugee response community? And just thinking about with record numbers of refugees coming out of Syria and Venezuela, what were the things that UNHCR and those of you in leadership at UNHCR were considering prior to the COVID pandemic?
Well, Nicole, let's be reminded of what we're talking about. And again, when I talk about some numbers, we're talking in such magnitudes that it's very difficult to get a real picture of what we're faced with. Almost 80 million people forcibly displaced. That was the figure that we had in place as of the end of 2019. So pre-COVID, pre-pandemic. That is 1% of the world's population. About 5 countries make up 2/3 of the displaced population. And you've just mentioned a couple of them: Syria, Venezuela, South Sudan, Myanmar, Afghanistan. Those are the 5 countries. And what we have seen in terms of displacement is an overlay of different factors causing people to move, from climate and environmental issues, poor governance, human rights abuses, and civil war, conflict, and persecution for a number of other factors. So when we talk about forced displacement, we're talking about the size of a country that is probably the 20th largest in the world. And so these are obviously individuals and people we're talking about. When we've talked in previous sessions, some of the trend lines haven't changed too much. We still are 85% of refugees are in the developing world. Most stay very close to home. And when I say that, about 3/4 of them will be in neighboring countries. Again, if we're talking about Syria, in Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon. And we also see factors in terms of the length of displacement. For Syria, we're in the 10th year of that particular crisis and conflict. And that has meant that those that may want to go home aren't able to, for security reasons, for other reasons, absent political solutions. And that's probably, you know, again, pre-COVID, the absence of solutions. We have a couple of bright spots on the horizon. I would say the Sudan situation might be one of them, but that's actually a situation that's really manifested itself during this most difficult year. So displacement generally, I would say, is on the rise. Our projections for next year, or what's going to be happening during this year, and we'll talk some more about that, is not that the numbers will decrease. If anything, some of our projections, when we talk about what the requirements may be for the humanitarian community, we're looking at numbers upwards of 85 million displaced persons. And so this is when solutions become so important. And if you then mark the beginning of the pandemic, let's recall a couple of things. One, we had just 1 year since the Global Compact on Refugees was adopted, and we can talk some more about that. Yeah. And we had just come out of this almost euphoric moment, which is the first manifestation of the compact, the Global Refugee Forum, where we had over 3,000 participants, refugees front and center in terms of articulating what it was that they needed in terms of self-reliance and solutions. And we had this, you know, a groundswell of support from governments, from private sector, from academics like yourself, from organizations, international financial institutions, all wanting to have a part of how we find solutions for displaced populations and refugees in particular. So that's how we came into 2020 and the beginnings of the pandemic.
That's remarkable. So a really significant problem, but also the international community coming together in ways which we hadn't seen, which is also a wonderful development. Let me ask, how then did the pandemic and then the resulting economic crisis impact the work you were doing, and obviously also the rate of displacement that you were seeing?
Well, in terms of the displacements, obviously they have continued. Even in this era of increasing border restrictions, difficulties of movements, increasing lockdowns, conflicts have continued, and you still have situations, of course, where people have needed to leave in order to save their own lives. We have seen generosity of countries, including, I give you one example, Uganda, where we had, I think it was about 15,000 Congolese that basically had come to the border trying to get into Uganda in terms of what was happening in DRC, where they needed a place to go to be able to exercise their right to asylum. The Ugandan government opened the border, allowed them in, isolated, quarantined, did some testing, and then they were allowed in as refugees. There are situations, though, where we have seen increasing numbers of border restrictions. There are over 100 countries that have somehow either put in restrictions in terms of full closure of borders, inwards and outwards, or within countries had lockdown procedures that have been very difficult in terms of the ability for either refugees to move or those internally displaced to move to safer areas. In terms of economic impact, there are probably, we've seen 2 or 3 different elements here. And we talk about a pandemic. You've heard that there is a hunger pandemic, and this is where, for example, some of the statistics that the World Food Program has put out, about 265 million people at risk of food insecurity and at risk of starvation. You then look at the pandemic, the economic pandemic in terms of the poverty pandemic. And when we talk about forcibly displaced, we're talking about people that are largely dependent on the informal sector. And what has disappeared first? It is those jobs that refugees depend on in those sectors where they may be particularly inclined or able to find employment or some kind of income. And who is most impacted? It tends to be female-headed households or women, particularly in the service industry and elsewise, who will then, of course, not be able to find the jobs that they have relied on before. The statistics now that are coming out in terms of the overall economic meltdown and what that might mean in terms of jobs and employment in the future is really quite concerning, because what you've seen is that the inequality has already grown this year in terms of the haves and the have-nots. The rich have become wealthier with regard to the world markets. The poor, and I put displaced in terms of being some of the most vulnerable, have become poorer. And this is where we've partnered with the international financial institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and on the private sector side, the International Financial Corporation, to look at ways where we can make sure that we've got the right kind of analysis in terms of where we need to provide additional support. One of the things that we have done this year, and largely because of the economic impacts, is scaled up substantially our cash-based assistance. And this is to be able to pay rent or school fees, or to be able to pay for food because of increasing hunger and malnutrition. And that is going to be essential, not as a short-term necessarily humanitarian inject. We see that as a long-term need. So partnering with the financial institutions to make sure that the humanitarian immediate support is then coupled with larger, longer-term systemic support to be able to provide some kind of income and economic opportunity to those that need it, including the displaced persons first and foremost. And that has been something that we've prioritized. We're now, during the pandemic, I think 50 million people served through cash-based interventions overall. We have now present, I think, about 65 countries, COVID-related only, but overall, we're close to 100 countries where we've got cash infusions going into a number of refugees and displaced persons, some of whom were not on our cash rolls before, but it's only because of the pandemic that they have fallen below either the poverty level or have become extremely vulnerable because of the pandemic and needed additional support. So the socioeconomic impacts, I don't think, can be underestimated. And that's a global issue, but I think, again, some of the most vulnerable are refugees and displaced persons.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I know UNHCR focuses also obviously on long-term and durable solutions for people, whether that is repatriation back to their country of origin or settling them permanently in the country that has hosted them. Have those efforts been stalled also by Corona, either because people don't want new populations returning back to the country potentially with new infections, or because there's some retribution in countries that are hosting refugees?
It's interesting because, some of the repatriation operations, yes, have been stalled. But as the restrictions have either been lessened or removed, they've been able to restart some of those operations. And there are some actually that have continued throughout the pandemic. And I give you one example. We have Burundi refugees in a number of countries. And the number that have signed up actually to go back to Burundi now have increased quite markedly in the last weeks and months. The largest population, I would say, is from Tanzania, but there are also Burundi refugees in the neighborhood who have said, I want to go back. There are other elements where, again, we should be looking at what is causing the movement. Is it the lack of support, assistance, jobs, education in the country of asylum, or is it really that the situation is safe back in home villages, home countries, and what have you? We have seen during the last months a large number of Venezuelan refugees who have gone from Colombia back to Venezuela. And that has been because of the lack of opportunity and support, even though the Colombian government has been quite generous with including refugees and migrants in their social safety nets, in their protection schemes in terms of being able to support. It hasn't been enough. And you've seen a steady stream of Venezuelans going back to Venezuela, despite not having the capacity in the home country to support themselves. Similarly, for Syrians, for a period of time there, and again, it depends how open or closed the border may be. When the border has been somewhat open, you've seen a lot of Syrians in Lebanon go back to parts of Syria that have been safer because Lebanon has been so difficult, and obviously the impact of the blast, certainly, but across the country, the price increases, the economic difficulties of the country at large, it has been exceedingly difficult for refugees to be able to sustain themselves. It's one of the countries where we have the largest cash-based intervention program because of the need to support. And so there have been a number of Syrians returning spontaneously. And then tomorrow we see the border with Jordan opening back up. It'll be interesting to see, do refugees decide that some of them want to go back again for whatever reason, they can't support themselves or don't have the kind of safety net that they need in their countries of asylum. Organized repatriations. I mean, we have a humanitarian evacuation program through Niger from Libya, which for a period of time, from Niger then to Rwanda and other locations, for a time that was postponed, suspended, because of the travel and the border restrictions. One of our big concerns, Nicole, in all of this is, you know, it is certainly logical, some steps that governments are taking in order to protect health and safety of the community at large. And a big theme for us, going back again to the compact, is inclusion, that we should be treating refugees and displaced as citizens of the country in terms of including them in health, in the health system and the health support. The border, the restrictions though, in terms of movement, the big concern is that these restrictions get baked in for the long term, that they then become permanent, where we would argue, of course, you can protect health and safety while respecting human rights and the ability for people to flee to safety. And that is a trend line that we're watching very, very closely. But I also say, you know, again, on the protection side, this has been a really unique opportunity to see how one can use innovation to perform what would normally be very much in-person contact with refugees and displaced. Community protection monitoring, refugees as being, you know, the first line responders. There have been a number of very innovative tools that our teams have used in various operations around the world. And on the protection side, countries that have taken steps where something would be an in-person interview, for example, for a refugee status determination, now they can use a screen as we're talking to each other in terms of someone being able to make the case, not necessarily needing to go into an office to make that case, but still be protected in another way. And there are several countries that have decided to go in that direction in order to offer this kind of international protection.
Fascinating. Let me ask on that last point, do you then see UNHCR's operations changing somewhat? You know, I think many of us have been forced to do things which we never thought we could do or would do. And we're all rethinking how we do different things. We've seen positive sides, right? Where we've seen decreased environmental damage at a time when no one's driving or when people are using public transportation. Do you see significant opportunities coming out? It's going to be our last question, but I want to just build on your point about new ways of doing business. Do you see those opportunities emerging as well?
Well, first, we have learned that the world of virtual bilateral discussions and conferences to raise attention, awareness, and funding for critically underfunded humanitarian operations, the relationships that one needs to develop in order to further a political breakthrough or a solution in another way, screens don't cut it.
Yeah,
you can do
great.
only so much, you know, in terms of the diplomatic multilateral engagement. There are definitely constraints.
Yeah.
That the other piece that gets a bit old is that having contact with operations with our team members, because from the very beginning we have taken us, you know, and this has been UN wide. This is not UNHCR specific, but we're very much part of this. There has been a strong message that we will stay and we will deliver, that we have a duty to serve, and that we will take care of ourselves, each other, and take care of the people that depend on us as lifelines, as ways to protect and aid. And that you do need to have contact with the people that you're working with. Doesn't necessarily always have to be in person, like I mentioned. I mean, we're making incredible use of WhatsApp and some of the technology in terms of helplines and other outreach mechanisms that are quite different and have been unique, are now becoming more commonplace. But there also, I think, there's much more room now in terms of innovation for us to rethink how it is we deliver our programs. And the collaboration we've had with other partners, I think, has been really unprecedented over the last few months. How we're working within both the UN family, but we've got huge partnerships with NGOs, and in this regard, particularly with local non-governmental organizations. Those that were there before, they'll be there a long time afterwards, looking at the impact on host communities as well as refugee populations. And I could talk a long time about this, but this might need to be part 2 of this conversation: business innovation, and how it is that we do things differently as a United Nations. And there are lots of exciting advancements that we've seen and have taken advantage of. I mean, it was almost just overnight that we turned into a virtual organization. And at any one time, there was one occasion, I think we had about 88% of our colleagues on some kind of a telework status. So they were delivering, but they were doing it in a different way. And maybe they were able to go into the refugee communities, for a week, but then they were out for a week, but continuing kind of this accordion effect. And so I think it also has brought home to us, can we not be delivering things differently? Thinking about what are we location dependent on and what is location independent? And even things like office space. I'm sitting in a building right now that is 95% empty. Yeah. In Europe, with all of the infections spiking through the ceiling. So it's, and we're continuing to work. We may be working from our basements, but we're continuing to work.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, Kelly, can you just speak a bit? I know it could be a 2-hour conversation, but just where do you see the new or different actors that are speaking into this space now? You mentioned businesses, or regional organizations. Do you see a number of new actors that are either gaining in prominence or just new to the field of responding to refugee needs?
I go back to December and again to the Global Refugee Forum and the partnerships that were coalescing around inclusion, self-reliance, empowerment, solutions. And how important it was to be able to have some of those partnerships already either in place or solidified during, there were over 1,000 pledges made by governments and by private sector and other organizations. We have been able to capitalize on that interest and that support and those partnerships now during the pandemic. And we've actually seen greater support. I'll give you an example. In December, we had $250 million that were pledged by business for refugees and for displacement. There were pro bono work on the part of law firms, or there were offers made of jobs for refugees, or distance learning opportunities for college students, refugees that wanted to advance their education, all kinds of different ways. And the private sector really stepped forward in December, and we've seen that only grow in both magnitude and in scope. We really feared that there would be such a deviation away from the displacement and the refugee situations that we were advancing, but it's been quite the opposite. We've had several businesses who, frankly, were not so familiar with what we were doing, step forward and say, we want to contribute, we want to do something that's going to be able to support, and we'll do it in different ways. We were part of this solidarity fund that the World Health Organization with private sector partners and so on advanced in terms of being able to provide additional support in refugee settings, and that has been very much successful. And then we've had a couple of businesses. I'll give you an example. One partner, Unilever, donated 30 million bars of soap. and to 20 different operations. And obviously in a situation like this pandemic that's so much tied to health, hygiene, sanitation, these are the sorts of I think this is beyond symbolic. These are partners then that we can depend on going forward in terms of being able to find ways to better partner to solve displacement situations and help refugees, truly become agents of change and of their own destinies and futures.
One last question for you. That's extraordinary just to hear how there's been sort of a sea change in just how to think about refugees, but also how to garner new support. We've heard a lot about building back better, right? How do we take all of what we've seen in the COVID crisis and the economic devastation as well and think differently? Are there opportunities, one or two opportunities that you can name where you can think about how this will place UNHCR to be able to build greater support or greater awareness in the international community, just to be able to respond to such a significant need and vulnerability in an important community?
So back in 2016 at the World Humanitarian Summit, there was a great focus on localization. And in fact, it became part of the grand bargain. And there's been obviously intensive work done on making sure that the resources and support go to those that are closest to the operations. And this there's been intensive work, but I think this year has probably proven why that is so important. That in terms of our ability to be able to provide resources to the first responders, and that's local and refugee-led organizations, but it's also ensuring that we've got the refugee voice truly considered in terms of aid delivery and aid design, in terms of what's provided. And I think there's nothing that would replace that now, because we have countless examples of operations where, had we not had strong community volunteer networks that refugees had established, either they'd done it independently in a grassroots effort, or they've been assisted by ourselves or other partners to provide. But it's those sorts of things that then they have to be mainstreamed, because that's, I think, where we're going to see the biggest changes going forward, not just with the pandemic response, but more generally with humanitarian and the close ties that we have with the development side and long-term engagement. And I would say that's probably one of the most exciting parts of this year, is to see those voices raised and to see the actions recognized and taking place with us, but in a different capacity.
Yeah. Well, that's a great, inspiring point to end on. Let me say thank you, Kelly, for taking the time. It's wonderful to be reconnected with an old colleague and just to see the great work that you're doing. Thanks for taking the time. But more importantly, thank you for all that you've been doing for so many years to serve refugee populations and to really ensure that there's the focus that the world should have on this community and helping them in these times. Thank you. And I look forward to being in touch.
You bet. Thanks a lot.
I'm here, Catherine Donato. I am professor in the School of Foreign Service and also director of the Institute for the Study of International Migration. And today I have the pleasure of introducing Laura Thompson, who is the Deputy Director for the International Organization for Migration, which is now part of the UN, and I'm sure she'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. We're having this conversation as part of the Global Challenges class in MSFS. And so I look forward to the students. I look forward to talking with you in a debriefing session, which I think is about 8 or 9 days away. All right, so I'm going to ask Ms. Thompson to first tell us a little bit about how she became Deputy Director, what her sort of biographical path has been, and then we'll talk more about COVID.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you very much for the invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to some of your students at Georgetown University. So it's a long story, but I studied law in Costa Rica, and then I started at the diplomatic service of Costa Rica, my career. My first post was at UNESCO, and my second post there was in the UN office in Geneva. So I worked as a diplomat for quite a bit of time, and then I entered into the UN system. So I have worked half of my life as a diplomat of Costa Rica, and the other half of my life as a staff member of the UN. I had very interesting positions, including I was appointed at some point ambassador of Costa Rica to the UN in Geneva, and I hold that position. When I was in that position, the opportunity for the Deputy Director General position of IOM came out. There was at the time an election process. That election process now has been eliminated, but when I entered the organization, it was an election process. So I ran and I won the election, which was against 4 men. And that was a good thing for, I think, from a gender perspective. And I have been the Deputy Director General of IOM since 2009. So I started in September, and I'm almost leaving my position now because there is now a process of selection of 2 Deputy Director Generals. So the good news is that I am going to be replaced by 2 persons.
Well, maybe it was bad news for you, since it seems like you've done 2 jobs. But the good news for IOM and the future maybe for IOM is that, yeah, the recognition of all your work now means that there are 2 positions. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So let's turn our our attention now to COVID. Certainly, we've read, we know there are broad impacts, certainly on migrants all around the world. So I'm just going to ask you to speak to what you see, what IOM has been dealing with since the pandemic started, and where you think the biggest challenges lie.
Sure. Let me focus on the impact on migrants, because I think that's the most important impact. Obviously, IOM as an organization was impacted too, and the work that we have been doing was heavily impacted by the pandemic and by the lockdowns. But I want to focus myself on the impact on migrants, really, because there are a number of areas in which there has been an important impact of the pandemic or of the lockdowns and the restrictions on mobility that have been created as a result of the pandemic. So let me start by what I would describe the huge socioeconomic impact that the pandemic has had in the life of migrants. First of all, loss of jobs. Obviously, the pandemic has had that as a result of, for a lot of people, not only migrants, but migrants have 2 specific conditions that make them, I would say, much more vulnerable to these type of measures. First of all, they are highly represented in the informal sector of the economy. So they are less protected in that sense by a number of measures that we're taking. And secondly, they are more vulnerable. If an employer has to dismiss some people, very often the foreigners are the first ones to leave, even if they perform very well. So that is an important vulnerability that we have identified. There have been some restrictions that have, obviously, mobility restrictions have impacted very much the life of migrants. I will give you an example. In Africa, the informal traders that move across borders, they have been stopped. And in this case, 70% of them are women. As a result of that, there has been a huge impact in their livelihoods because of the pandemic. There has been also, I would say, an increase in xenophobia, in discrimination. Migrants were perceived in a lot of places as those that were bringing the illness, the pandemic to the country, which was not true. But the reality is that there was a perception. Obviously, we have seen a huge amount or a huge increase in child abuse, in gender-based violence at home, and that obviously has also an impact for migrant women too. An important reduction of remittances, which has, because of the loss of jobs, but also because of the fact that a lot of the money transfers were closed, and nobody thought that they were, essential things to remain open, services to remain open. So that loss of reduction in remittances have had an impact both in the life of migrants, but also in the lives of the families back home in the countries of origin, in a reduction of access to food, access to health services, access to education, housing, etc. So that has had, I would say, a double impact. And obviously there have been an important number of returns of migrants to the countries of origin. Very often, these communities were not ready to receive a large amount of people coming back. So as a result of that, they didn't have very many possibilities to develop something back home. In addition to that, I would say the other problem, it has been that up to a certain point, there has been an exclusion of migrants from the socioeconomic support measures that have been undertaken in different countries around the world. And this is not because of a specific exclusion, but migrants very often are invisible to the systems. They don't exist for them. And as a result of that, they have not been covered by that. From a humanitarian perspective, there have been obviously refugees, internally displaced persons live in very conglomerations, high dense conglomerations, and in camps or in other type of settlements, and that has been difficult also, and they have very limited access or poor access to hygiene and to these type of things that are extremely relevant in this. And finally, I would say the other thing that was very important is on the health impact. Migrants are often excluded from access to health, sometimes because they are in a regular situation, undocumented, and they don't have access to it, sometimes because of the high costs of access to medical care, and sometimes just because of other barriers like language or other type of things where they really don't feel that they have access to it. There were a number of stranded migrants that were caught, I would say, in the middle, either in transit countries or in destination countries where they lost their jobs, but they could not get back because of the lockdowns and the travel restrictions. So different, as you can see, is a large amount of impacts in different areas that have made the life of migrants quite difficult at this point.
Yeah, so I do a little, I have a project in Bangladesh, and one of course, Bangladesh sends many formal workers, right, to the Gulf, as well as Bangladeshis are actually in many migration streams all over the world. And what, what I've learned is that the Bangladeshi government organized very quickly a program. I don't know if IOM was involved in this program, but a program to facilitate people returning. They would meet them at the airport. They would facilitate their travel, let's say from Dhaka to wherever. They would also make sure that there were basic health, health services available. Does IOM, or did you have any examples of that, those kinds of programs, government responses to essentially the repatriation of many migrants back?
Many examples. We, in some cases, governments did ask for our support on doing that, but the majority of governments, I would say, they made an effort to try to repatriate as much as possible people, nationals that were left outside, and there were a number of programs in that regard. The majority of the countries that had national airlines, they use their national airlines to repatriate people. But in other cases, I would say the example of Spain with the Latin American countries, that a large number don't have national airlines, but they use the flights from Iberia to bring back also Latin Americans when they were going towards Latin American countries to pick up the Spanish that were returning. So there has been a lot of very good collaboration among different countries, and I would say a lot of goodwill that has been shown. Also, the majority of countries also look for providing some basic support to the nationals coming back. But as I said, it's different to come back and get an initial support, but then if you don't have a community that can absorb you up to a certain extent and provide you with some type of ability to develop some livelihood, is almost impossible. And obviously with the COVID situation, even the locals that were still there and working there many of them have lost their jobs. So obviously it has been a very difficult situation for countries like Bangladesh that you mentioned, but a large number of other countries in the developing countries.
Yeah, the situation is at best uneven. So before, I do want to ask you about opportunities, but before we get there, can you talk about, I know you said you want to focus on migrants, and I understand that focus certainly, but I mean, as migrants were facing the realities of COVID and the pandemic, and governments, of course, also, both host governments and sending country governments. IOM was, I imagine, in a position to facilitate in different ways. And I mean, I know that you have to be invited in and, et cetera. There's got to be permission, but still, I just wonder what, IOM has been so impressive to me in that, it keeps its overhead down. It does so much operational work. So given that, I just wonder, could you speak to, some of the operations work that perhaps IOM had to do differently as a result of the pandemic, or, a few examples might be interesting for, I think, the students to know about.
Sure. Well, obviously, it was clear since the very beginning that for the organization that deals with human mobility, the pandemic was going to have a huge impact in the way that we work. We have offices in 165 countries, and the majority of our offices, as you said, are very much field-based, oriented to do programs and projects with migrants and beneficiaries all around. And obviously we had a number of, I would say, challenges that we need to address very quickly. First of all, how do you keep providing humanitarian assistance to refugees, to internally displaced persons, and to migrants with the restrictions that the COVID-19 created, the social distancing, the avoidance of having direct contact with a lot of people. It was very difficult for us to find ways that our staff could continue performing the jobs and serving our beneficiaries without putting them in risk. And that was a huge managerial effort to try to identify manners to do it. We had a number of programs that were totally blocked because we have a number of programs that relate to human mobility. For example, the resettlement of refugees, in which IOM is heavily involved around the world, in the United States particularly, but not only, Australia, Canada, European countries. So all those movements of people stop. There are other programs like assisted voluntary return of migrants that happens very much from Europe to developing countries also had to stop. So we had to basically enter into the challenge of moving all that amount of staff that were working on these type of programs and find solutions for them temporarily. So fortunately, as you said, we have a very operational logic. And immediately we started trying to look at what new was necessary. And we identified a number of things that were necessary to do in border management, for example. There had been an increased interest of governments to try to incorporate some specific health measures, to prevent, obviously, transfer of illnesses. I think it came very clearly that, like after September 11 attacks, we have this increased security in the world, the airport level. When you are going to board the plane, you have to go through all this process of security checking, etc. Now, I think in addition to that, we're going to have a number of health-related checks that we will need to pass, because I think COVID-19 has brought to the attention of the world the importance and the risks that the human mobility, which is absolutely necessary for the world that we live in, implies also for the health of the population. So we found a number of opportunities, and we did a big effort to try to start addressing those. So there has been a large amount of new activities that the organization has developed in this process. And yeah, we're still surviving. And I think we not only surviving, but we are actually very committed to try to find new ways of helping the world to get back to a kind of normal. We are not totally sure that human mobility is going to be the same after the COVID-19. I think there will be some changes. Nonetheless, it is absolutely fundamental for the world, and I think for all of us that have moved around all our lives, to have still the possibility to continue moving around with a certain level of normality after the COVID-19 is, I would say, dealt with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I imagine that, there are some countries for which migration is an important form of revenue, right? Leads to remittances and all kinds of other revenue, and not only individuals, right, but groups and entities and governments. It's in everyone's interest, or many people's interest, right, to most of ours, to develop, or maybe it's a redevelopment of the migration system so that it can continue to be largely safe and orderly, but at the same time, as you say, implement new health measures maybe, and implement new ways of making sure, right, that illness doesn't get easily passed on during.
Absolutely. And if I may, there are also some very positive elements that came out from this COVID-19 related to migration. I think very quickly, governments realized that migrants were in the first line of response for some of the quite fundamental and essential services that governments needed to ensure to the continuation. So for example, in the health service, a large number of something around, I think it is 30% of the doctors and nurses are migrants in some of the developed countries. The US is an example of that. The UK, another example of that. But there are a large number of developed countries that rely heavily on doctors and nurses from abroad in their normal conditions, okay? So there have been a huge effort that a number of countries have made, and there are very innovative measures that they took in order not only to guarantee that they stay, but also to bring other people that were within their borders and were health practitioners to have their titles recognized or the diplomas recognized, or give them specific permissions to work in the health services or para-health services, because because of the huge need that they had. The other areas, agriculture, for example. Countries saw very quickly that if they lose the temporary or the seasonal workers, the products will remain where they were. And even the population that was losing jobs could not do that job necessarily immediately. So as a result of that, they took a number of measures to open borders again for these seasonal workers in order to be sure that agriculture continues functioning normally. The distribution and supply chain sector was exactly the same. So all these people suddenly were also able to move despite the restrictions, and I would say encouraged to do that. So there are some very positive elements and I would say examples of measures that different governments have taken in order to allow this to happen.
Yeah, and I don't know, that's true in the United States, certainly, right? The essential workers, the percent who are foreign born, and then if you were to add the children of immigrants in the essential workers, this is a very high percentage. You know, if you add the children of immigrants, it exceeds 50% on average, right? And in some occupations, it's higher, right, than others. And I do think you bring up so on the one hand, you know, in the US, there's been recognition of the immigrant as the essential worker. Even the immigrant cleaner, right? Most of the custodians in the United States, I assume in Europe, but I'm not sure, but in the United States, certainly most people who clean, whether they're custodians at a commercial level or in a personal household level, are migrants as well. And if you have a pandemic and, you know, cleaning is critically important when there's illness around. So there's recognition, unlike in the past, even for the lower skilled work that migrants do. In the United States, there is no limitation on the number of temporary agricultural worker visas. As a result of this. But again, I don't know where in the US, I mean, in other countries, I know there have been also ways of facilitating people entering temporarily, right, to continue to keep the food chain and the food supply chains, right, well stocked. So yes, that's certainly a benefit. Or certainly a sort of a new way of looking at migrants.
Yeah.
And course,
I want to come back, sorry to cut you, but I want to come back to your point of opportunities, because I think there are very clear opportunities here that we really need to think about. First of all, that's a big opportunity. I mean, we have to really change the old discussion about, you know, skilled migrants are welcome and non-skilled migrants are not welcome. I think this crisis has shown all of us that skilled doesn't equal essential, okay? And that there are a large number of migrant workers that are essential for the functioning of normal functioning of a country that are not skilled, and that they need to be not only respected, but also recognized, because they have been present at the moment that everybody was staying at home with the children. So it is important. I think that's a big opportunity of a shift in the logic that we have seen in the past.
Think about, right.
The other element that I think is extremely important now is that it has become very clear that access to health services and universal coverage of health is not something of a matter of generosity, but it's a matter of necessity. We have seen that if you have an amount of population that is not covered by your social health coverage, they can they become obviously much more vulnerable to a pandemic, and they can spread a virus like this all over the place. So it is absolutely fundamental that we understand that health coverage, universal health coverage, is a must in our societies. And as the UN Secretary General said, no one is safe until everyone is safe. And this is the real case in this situation. The other opportunity that I see very much is I am actually asking myself whether we are not at the doorstep of a revolution in the labor market system, because we have been all forced to learn how to work in this new reality. No, we are doing this today. In a normal times, I would have come to Washington and provided this class with you and have this discussion with you in Washington. I have been doing meetings with all my staff. I have participated in a huge number of panels, discussions, meetings that have brought together people from all over the world. And now it has become almost natural to do this. At the beginning, it was a kind of weird for all of us. And now I feel that it's weird when I have people sitting in my office. So the reality is that we have learned how to use modern communication systems and new technologies. So let's think about what is the impact of that in the labor market, in the global labor market. Imagine tomorrow the number of skills or the type of skills that companies or public sector entities need, and imagine a world where everybody can apply to whatever position wherever in the world. So how is this going to totally shift the labor market realities, and what are the elements that we need to create in order to make this future labor market that could be virtual totally, okay? That could be totally virtual without going to through national restrictions, migratory laws, or international transfers, and have the possibility for workers to apply everywhere, but also for employers to hire. So we might be at a moment that is totally a game changer in the global labor market system. And I am going to be quite interested to follow this, because I think it opens a huge opportunity and might change substantially the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. There are people now talking a bit about this, right? There was already a shift toward more tech work, right? Before any of this happened, even in manufacturing companies and production lines. But now, it could be that all work that can be done with technology, now the assumption is it does get done. So you may be a migrant in terms of your work. You may be working for a company in India, but you may be living in the United States. And some people were already doing that, but certainly I have many friends in San Diego who were working in Tijuana as professionals. But now the extent to which you can do that from your home or from a place that isn't the place that you need to migrate to do the work. Yeah, that's a very sort of 21st century way of thinking about migration. Still, there will always be migration some of it has to happen, right? Face to face, because of the nature of the work, agricultural work, but also, healthcare, caregiving, cleaning, etc. But a lot of the work that we do as a world economy is done, and increasingly now through the pandemic will be done using these platforms. And the platforms will become more sophisticated, correct? I mean, I'm sure the tech companies are working now to facilitate this kind of work.
Yeah, and imagine the impact that that will have, for example, to women, to disabled people, to, you know, a number of people that had difficulties living in a country because they have families and it becomes extremely complicated, or some type of limitations, and they are not as you know, flexible and mobile as others. So imagine what a change that could be. I think we have to be excited about that. I think it is a huge opportunity, and as you said, there are a number of jobs that will obviously need to continue happening in a real time presence, no? And that's without doubt. But there, I think if 5 years ago or 3 years ago, there were a limited number of jobs that we thought could be done remotely, I think today that limited number has expanded substantially. And we have realized, employers and managers, that there is a huge facility to do the work still from far away. And that can be a game changer, as I said.
Yeah, that will be a big game changer. I'm sure it will play out. The question will be by how much, right? And 20 years from now, what will migration flows look like? And will they always, you know, I mean, I think we're suggesting that they will not always mean that people have to physically move and cross borders in a physical real-time way. Well, listen, thank you. This has been fabulous. I think that, you know, the pandemic has certainly been very difficult for many, many people, but there are opportunities in every crisis and difficult moment that the world has, that we personally have. So there are some interesting opportunities that loom ahead now, and they could be game changers for shifting the entire system in new ways. So I don't know if you have anything more to say, but
just I think you know, I could have speak for hours about vulnerabilities because there are many, and as you said, they have a lot of people that have been terribly impacted by this situation. But I think for your students that are people that are going to be the future leaders in the next 20 years, I think it is extremely important that they also think about how these tragic situations can generate huge opportunities for the world, because we all have seen that we need these very good opportunities more and more with the current situation as it is. So it is important also to focus on that part and be aware, because we need to, these things, we need to promote them. We need to work on them, and we need to make them go in the right direction. And for that, we need strong leaders to understand how, what are the impacts that these paths will have.
Oh. Well, thank you. Thank you for that eloquent ending. And let me stop recording. But I hope that everyone watching this video, before I stop, please remember that Ms. Thompson has been extremely generous with her time. We really want to thank you from Georgetown.
Hi, everybody. I'm Beth Ferris. I'm a professor in the Institute for the Study of International Migration at Georgetown School of Foreign Service. And I'm delighted to speak today with Robert Mominee, who is a SFS graduate and now working in South Sudan. So, Robert, thanks for joining us. And if by chance the connection goes out, we'll just pause and hope that you can rejoin us quickly. But tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got to South Sudan.
So I'm an MSFS graduate. So my graduate program was International Development Concentration within MSFS, and I did the ISIM Humanitarian Emergencies and Refugee Certificate. So that was my education right before I came to South Sudan. So I'm currently working with the International Organization for Migration in South Sudan, where I am a camp manager in WOW and the state focal point for camp coordination and camp management in Western Bahr el Ghazal. So sort of the longer arc is I graduated with a philosophy degree from Bowling Green State University. I joined the Peace Corps shortly thereafter. And then I worked a bit in youth nonprofits in Chicago. I worked in tourism for a spell, and then found my way to MSFS. So kind of a long journey, and I've been in South Sudan now for around 3.5 years.
Oh my goodness. And are you based in WOW?
Yeah, correct. I'm based in WOW. I started off in Juba, but about a year ago, I'm based in WOW.
Okay, tell us about your living situation. Do you live in a compound? Do you live with other NGOs and international organizations, or are you living in the community?
Yeah, so in WOW, we have a house. So all the IOM international staff are living together. So there's around 10 of us in a big walled compound. If you imagine like a cement motel, that's sort of what it looks like. And then we share a compound with our logistics base. So there's some warehouses. You might be able to hear some of that in the background, apologies. And then there's our main office, which is a cement office. So we have a mixture. Right behind me is a container. So that's a prefabricated room, not very large. That's the standard setup of where we live. So it's not the most glamorous conditions, but certainly you develop strong relationships with your colleagues.
I'm sure you do. Well, tell us a little bit about your work. What do you do as a camp manager?
So camp management, so we're in a humanitarian emergency situation. So South Sudan has been torn apart by many years for violence and civil war. Right now in 2020, we're seeing the end results of a peace agreement that's been many years in the making, but still we see some localized conflicts, not a full implementation of the peace process, so it's a bit touch and go. So during that crisis, actually series of crises really since independence of South Sudan, there's been a lot of people who've been displaced by war, and some of them settle in what we call camps. So if you imagine, you see on the news sometimes these sort of makeshift cities full of tents and a lot of humanitarian infrastructure and vehicles and water points. That's what I manage. So my job as camp manager, if you can imagine a municipal government where you are in Washington or in your hometown, you've got the elected leadership. And then you have like a city manager, which is sort of from a technical perspective. So we make sure that all of the service providers who are providing water, who are providing food, and who provide the roads and the tents and everything in the sites, that all of those people are coordinating well within each other, that the needs are being met. And then the IDP community can be involved also. So we facilitate some leadership elections. And then we also work alongside the UN peacekeeping mission and the South Sudanese government as the camp administrators. So it's really, it's coordination, it's community engagement, and it's a lot of accountability and working directly with IDPs.
Right. Do you know how many IDPs there are there, and how many are living in these camps?
There's, in the camp that I manage, there's around 9,500. Then I have a second camp, which is around 6,000. And then within the region, there's, let's say, around 30,000 people that our activities touch on. But across the country, we have a really high number. IOM manages a number of other camps, which are larger. Actually, my camp is a bit of a success story in terms of regional stability. It peaked at around 39,000, and then we've been assisting people to integrate back into their communities. So the numbers are going a bit down as people are able to return and the region stabilizes.
And what kind of needs do the IDPs have? How long have they been there? Mostly children, women, men?
It's the camp that I manage is a lot of women, especially women and children coming from the surrounding town. when there was fighting in the town from the Civil War. A lot of neighborhoods were destroyed, people's houses, people lost everything, and they ended up in the camps. So since 2016 and 2017 were the major influxes into the camp that I manage in WOW. And the needs were very basic, life-saving needs. So food, water, shelter, medical care. And now we're reaching into more of a protracted situation, but those frontline humanitarian needs definitely remain. But also, people need to be assisted to regain their land, to rebuild their homes in return areas. And that's also some of the transitional programming that we work on.
Well, it's good to hear that there are some returns. I mean, sometimes these protracted situations go on for just way too long. So yeah. To tell me about the other organizations that are there. Are there a lot of NGOs, other UN agencies?
Yeah, the whole humanitarian community is there. So there's around 26 partners that work in my site, which are UN agencies, funds, and programs. And there's a number of NGOs, international NGOs, both local NGOs, and then there's some government ministries such as Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education that do some coordination work inside of the site. So it's really a diverse set of organizations. Both at the local level, international UN agencies, plus ICRC. And then there's a kind of a peace and transition monitoring organization that's there also. So it's the whole family. Right.
And a lot of South Sudanese NGOs as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So International Organization for Migration, we do a lot of direct implementation. So that means that I'm actually, I'm not just overseeing a fund, that I'm going into the camp and I'm the manager. But many UN agencies don't work through direct implementation, or they use kind of a combined approach. So they will receive funding from donors or from their member states, and then they will provide that to national NGOs. So the vast majority of service providers and on frontline workers, even from agencies that do direct implementation, are South Sudanese, highly qualified professionals and really just essential in terms of language, in terms of local context. We couldn't do it without them.
Well, that's great to hear. Also, let's talk about COVID-19. How is that affecting your camp or South Sudan in general?
I mean, it's had a huge effect, not only on my camp, but on sort of the humanitarian community in general. I would say that so let's talk about the community first and then maybe get into the wider response. Okay. So concerning the IDPs themselves, at the beginning when COVID first started to come to South Sudan and people were aware of it, so this is around March and April, there was really a great deal of anxiety inside of the site. So my camp is quite congested. It means that the shelters are close together. People are living with less than what we agree, or as a humanitarian community, what we would prefer because of space limitations. So congestion was a huge issue. So I think the first thing is that a lot of people, maybe before they were ready, or before they were fully capable of returning, did kind of a premature return. So they left the camp out of fear that COVID was going to spread. Another thing is that certain local authorities ended up closing some of the sites, so involuntarily. So these people were told, this is no longer a safe zone, you need to go and return somewhere else, you can't stay in these camps anymore. So some of the smaller camps were closed due to the risks of COVID-19. In terms of the actual, the health impacts of the virus, it's very difficult to say inside of the camp settings. In my camp, we have not had any confirmed cases, but I do have to admit that the testing is quite limited. So the ministry here only has a limited number of tests, so they're really testing high-risk cases. So I can't really say for certainty that it is in the camp or it's not in the camp, but certainly it's in the surrounding town. But we have not seen some of the worst case scenarios that we'd really planned for with our contingency. So the death rate has remained relatively consistent. Our health partners have been able to cope with the illnesses that are coming. So whether that's a result of our efforts or just a bit of sort of good luck in the fact that people are staying outdoors, most of their activities are outdoors, it's a younger population. I can't really say for certainty. Maybe that's something that we'll know as the virus wraps up, but cautious optimism and things have been relatively stable, except for that initial period in terms of the community.
What about things like PPE? Do the health workers have enough, or do people wear masks in the camp?
Yeah, it's definitely been a challenge. Luckily, our health partners are fairly well resourced. We've had, and some of the adaptations of COVID really came out of some of the Ebola preparedness and the other epidemic diseases that we've been preparing for. So there were robust coordination systems because Ebola is in the DRC, the neighboring country. So we've been building up a lot of those communication systems with the government, early response, isolation wards, and we were able to translate that over into the COVID-19 response. So that's been positive. However, with the community, there's a couple of things. People don't necessarily perceive the risk of COVID as being very high. And also sometimes the opinion of the community as well. Okay, we have the risk of waterborne diseases. We have the risk of malaria every year. And now COVID is just another kind of sickness that we can add on top of that. So it's been difficult to get that message across after March and April. So in the months more recently, we've done things like mass distributions. We've installed hand washing stations, a lot of risk mitigation measures, but the uptake by the community hasn't been as robust as we would like.
Right. But what are the general health concerns for the population? You mentioned malaria and other waterborne diseases. Are there other kind of prevalent health issues?
I think malaria is the big one, and sort of the standard tropical diseases that you would see within the region. And within any camp setting, health and hygiene, especially for water and sanitation, is hugely important. Anytime you have a lot of people together, cholera is a risk. And we've had in the past some measles outbreaks that we've been able to control. So the risk of all of these other kind of tropical and camp-related illnesses are there. Which is not specific to my camp, but it's the nature of the beast, I would say.
Right. What about the economic impact of COVID? Had there been shutdowns, for example? Have you seen increases in food prices?
Yeah, it's been really devastating, actually, in South Sudan, and especially in the WA region. So South Sudan is not a place, because of the impacts of the war. It's not very food self-sufficient. So much of the foodstuffs and the staples are being imported from neighboring countries, from Uganda, from Sudan. So the fact that those markets have been cut off, there's been border closures, and COVID is spread in some cases with the truck drivers and the transport systems. So prices have gone up. Inflation in South Sudan was already high, but we've reached really alarming levels. So the daily purchasing power of somebody, either in a camp or just in the surrounding community, has reduced. So we're seeing increases in the IPCs. So that's the food security indicators are not looking good. And we could be facing a very tough season ahead of us. And all of that is directly traced back to COVID-19. Just it compounds all of the needs and all of the fragility and lack of resilience that's already present in the community.
And do most displaced people live in the camps? Are there some that live outside and work in the informal sector?
Actually, the vast majority of people who are displaced in South Sudan do not live in camps. So they live within host communities, they live with family members, or they've managed to kind of settle in urban areas. So the camps are, within my mandate as camp manager, I'm definitely looking at the camps, but we have some we call area-based programming, where you try to reach the displaced people if they're in urban settings, if they're with their family members. But it's really difficult because South Sudan has a lot of need, and in many cases, the host community is in the same situation that the IDPs are in. So there's really a lot of need, both in the camps and outside of the camps. And then we talk about deep field locations. South Sudan is a country that does not have a lot of roads. We're using air operations to reach a lot of people. And sometimes these are only passable during the dry season, which lasts a couple of months. So the needs in deep field locations are also incredibly high. So there's definitely, the camps have a lot of need, but everywhere has a lot of need in this country.
Right. And what we've seen in other situations, that refugees, IDPs who are working in the informal sector are finding those jobs are ending, they're losing their jobs, or there's more exploitation, their wages are falling. I mean, you've seen the same thing in South Sudan with those not living in camps? Yeah,
absolutely. The economic crisis affects everyone. Yeah. I would say that the South Sudan has not had the kind of maybe formal shutdowns that you would imagine happening in Europe. Largely, if you talk to people, they say, yeah, so, we're fearful of COVID, but at the end of the day, life has to go on. So if I close my shop, I don't have anything to compensate with that. So the markets are still open. People are on the streets. I had a driver the other day joke with me. He said, well, COVID's in South Sudan, but if you were to go around, you wouldn't get the impression that COVID was on anyone's mind. So, you know, you have to eat at the end of the day. So you're going to go to work if you can.
Right, no, that's very clear. What about the impact on humanitarian operations? Is it hard to get around the country because of COVID restrictions?
Yeah, it's definitely been a disruption. So the first thing is just we have a lot of international staff, technical experts, financial experts, you know, people who are really at the heart of operations. And they have been, some cases, sorry, we're getting a rainstorm. Let me move indoors. So the question was related to the humanitarian community. So what I'll say is that it's been hugely disruptive. So a lot of the international staff maybe have been stuck in their home countries, have been unable to get flights, have been unable to kind of access the staff and to do all of the things that they need to do. So we've all had a crash course in remote management.
Mhm.
I mean, just like people who are trying to go to school, and finding the difficulty of online learning, that applies also to humanitarians. I think another thing would be, especially early on in COVID, COVID was really the focus of a lot of the strategic planning. It was the focus of a lot of the attention on assessments and mitigation measures, and we had to develop standard operating procedures kind of on the fly. So in some cases, like really acute needs or responses that were ongoing had to take a bit of a back seat to the COVID mitigation response. I think a lot of those kinks have been worked out, but if you talk to me in February, March, and April, definitely it was a scramble to see how bad is this going to be, and nobody really knew. So that's definitely been it. And also, I think the economic situation and the donor situation has been really affected by COVID-19. Not so much for UN agencies, I would say, but NGOs make up a huge portion of the humanitarian community. And for those organizations such as MSF, who rely upon a lot of personal donations and kind of small time, they've had their budget cut. And some of the international health volunteers for some of these organizations are now assisting with emergencies in their own country, so they're not available to come to humanitarian emergencies. So it's really been a kind of a system-wide shock, but it's our job to respond to shocks. So we've been getting along the best we can.
Yeah, sounds like it. You see in other organizations that funding has shifted to COVID away from kind of the standard, whether health or food or water or other basic services. So, yeah. Well, listen, Rob, what do you enjoy about your work?
Oh, it's hugely rewarding. It's something that you can get up every day as a camp manager, and you're never going to have the same day twice. I get to spend a lot of time with the community, doing some conflict resolution, you know, identifying people's needs, and to be able to do an assessment, to find out what people need, and then in a short amount of time to mobilize all the logistics and personnel and political engagement that it takes, and to see those services delivered is hugely rewarding. I mean, I kind of come from a philosophy, political science background ever since undergrad and really since high school. So for me, you know, I basically get to facilitate the operation of a little government here, and to involve people in holding elections, to involve the community in services and accountability and complaint mechanisms, and it's hugely rewarding. And I would be disingenuous if I didn't sometimes enjoy the feeling of hopping on a white helicopter, but I see that's a small part.
Okay. And I wonder if you could say anything about your experience at Georgetown. Did you feel like the courses you took helped prepare you for your work?
Yeah, Georgetown in graduate school was hugely beneficial to me in terms of understanding kind of the broader structure of humanitarian response and the UN system, and just sort of how international relations work, generally speaking. A lot of the like day-to-day humanitarian stuff, I mean, if your students are curious, you can find any technical manual online. So if you're interested in water or protection or camp management, you can read about all the technical standards. So a lot of that stuff you kind of pick up on the job. But the broader, I mean, thought processes and the writing skills, and this kind of top level structure, you're not going to get that on the job. And it definitely benefits you to understand like how negotiations work, how international organizations work from my studies at Georgetown. So yeah, it's hugely beneficial.
Oh, that's great. Any final thoughts? Anything I haven't asked that you'd like to talk about in terms of COVID's impact on South Sudan or the general political situation there?
Yeah, I would just say lastly that, so now I'm talking to you, it's around November or so, that I think that things are stabilizing in terms of, you asked me about the impact on the humanitarian community
Right.
and donor funding moving in different directions. I think I hesitate to say that we've accepted it as the new normal, but we have good systems now and people are not in a panic mode. And we understand how the disease is spread and what are the risk factors. So I think that increasingly donors are saying, okay, we want to see COVID mainstream, so another mainstreaming, rather than standalone COVID programming. But definitely the virus is not over yet, and the economic impacts and disruptions are going to continue. So we'll see what happens coming into 2021.
Okay, Rob, I realized I forgot to ask you about gender. I mean, how does gender affect COVID response or assistance programs generally in South Sudan?
Yeah, gender is hugely important. I think that it's something that you have to consider not as a standalone project or as a mainstreaming activity, but it has to be at the core of humanitarian response. Especially for camp management, a lot of people who are inside of the camps are female-headed households. Mothers are controlling a lot of the household spending, and some of the real high-risk caseloads, which is elderly people and very young people, it's women who are at the center of those survival and resilience systems. So having a good balance of male to female staff, having a gender sensitive and a gender informed approach, and really considering the needs of women, which are in many cases distinct from the needs of men. Sometimes they're complementary and overlapping, but they're not always represented within the male leadership structures. So for us, we try to have a gender balance. We try to engage women in our activities, and definitely the risk to some of the female members of the displaced community in terms of gender-based violence, in terms of lack of access to land and lack of access to markets, it is quite acute. So gender thinking and a gender perspective informs really everything that we do at a core level. That being said, I would say that it's important also not to miss out on some of the high-risk populations that are not female. So male who are at risk of recruitment from armed groups or combatants. Sexual and gender-based violence is not only limited to the female members of society, it's an issue that can touch on many groups. So when I talk about gender, sometimes we have an idea that we're thinking about, only women or young girls or adolescents, but a gender perspective means that you're considering groups and their specific risks and profiles, according to who they are and what group they belong to. So I would encourage students to sort of think wider about gender as not only a women's issues approach.
We talked about that in my class just this week about how gender isn't synonymous with women and other groups can be at risk. But listen, it's been great talking with you. Thanks so much for taking the time. We miss having you on campus and hope to see you back here on one of your home leaves sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. Next time I'm in DC, hopefully we'll have a vaccine, or I'm happy to call in. So it's the best to you. Any students who are watching, you can get my contact information from Professor Ferris. I'm happy to have a chat sometime or have an email exchange. So definitely want to keep myself as a resource to the SFS community. So thanks a lot for calling in, and stay safe on that side.
3 fascinating interviews. Let me pull out a few points to begin the discussion. First, it's important for us to reflect on where we are seeing tremendous increase in the vulnerability of populations that were already very vulnerable. How has COVID specifically impacted communities that lack for stable environments around them, who are in transit, for communities which are in difficult living, health, or employment situations? It's important that we unpack this question of how COVID is impacting not just the world, but particularly those communities that are most vulnerable. Second, in a number of areas, particularly on the refugee international collaborative side, we saw tremendous progress being made just a year before COVID hit. The question that we should be asking ourselves now is, what impact will COVID have on the development of some of these international collaborative networks? And how will the international community's focus on COVID impact their ability to collaborate and focus on some of these other very urgent issues like refugee and displaced persons? And finally, what opportunities can we draw from this period? We see increased international collaboration and a recognition in the world that international collaboration is needed for these very tricky international transnational problems. How will that impact the other transnational and global problems, such as refugee flows and migration flows? How will what we learn from COVID translate into other areas? I look forward to a great discussion.